Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. And what we're going to do today is continue with our country case study series. In this series, we look at a specific country, we zoom in on the migration history, the migration policy, and the current migration situation in that country. And today we're going to look at South Africa. So let's jump right in and get started. We'll start already back from the kind of pre-16th century. We'll move on to the Cape Colony period. Then we'll move on to the British colonialism period between 1870s and 1910. Then we'll look at the Union of South Africa, and then the period of apartheid between 1948 and 1994, and then the 1994 era to the present. So let's start first in the pre-16th century period. So what's very important to know from the beginning is that South Africa was not empty before white Europeans arrived. There were already a number of nomadic cultures within South Africa, but of course there's little recorded history before this point. So in the 4th century, migrants from the north settled the indigenous San and Khoikhoi people of the time. Then if we jump forward to 1480s, this is when we saw the first white Europeans to land in South Africa. Bartholomew Dias was a Portuguese navigator and the first European to travel around the southern tip of Africa. In 1497, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama also landed on the Natal coast. So you already started to see some of that immigration then from Europe already starting in the 15th century. In 1852, Jan van Riebeeck, representing the Dutch East Indian Company, founds the Dutch refreshment station at Table Bay, which is nowadays Cape Town. So there were a number of notable migration events during this period. There were the Dutch freeburgers who were released from their contracts and allowed to settle in the Cape. Slaves were also brought to the Cape from Mozambique, but even more so from Madagascar and also from Indonesia, India, and Ceylon, or what is of course nowadays modern-day Sri Lanka. The local pastoralists were pushed out of the region due to the Dutch expansion at this period. So there were two particularly significant migration events during this period. The first was between 1835 and 1840. This is when the Boers left the Cape Colony in what's called the Great Trek and found the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Then in 1816 and 1826, Shaka Zulu founded and expanded the Zulu Empire and created a formidable fighting force in this time period. So if we look first at the 1835 to 1840, this kind of great trek of the Boers who left the Cape Colony. So by the beginning of the 18th century, the Cape settlers were expanding their territory northeast, led by the Trek Boers, seeking a fresh grazing land for their cattle. As the trekkers' expansion increased, they inevitably came into conflict with the people who were already living in the areas where they were moving to. This was first the Khoikhoi and later the Xhosa people whose lands they were encroaching on. This development, and in particular the emancipation of slaves in 1834, really had a dramatic effect on the colony. And this really precipitated what was called the Great Trek, which was this emigration north and northeast of around 12,000 discontented Afrikaner farmers or Boers at the time. These people were determined to live independently of colonial rule and what they saw as an unacceptable racial egalitarianism at the time. So now let's turn to the period between 1816 and 1826, when Shaka Zulu founded and expanded the Zulu Empire. So at this time, Zulu's wars and conquests and those of others at the time caused a serious disruption in the interior, known to the Sotho speakers as, well, forced migration of the time, while Zulu speakers call it crushing. So I'll put up some of those Sotho words and those Zulu words here. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce them. Shaka set out on a massive program of expansion, killing or enslaving those who resisted in the territories he conquered, and of course created a wave of displacement throughout southern Africa and beyond. This process accelerated the formation of several states, notably those of the Sotho and of the Swazi at the time. So that was also previously present-day Lesotho and also now Eswatini. So now we can turn to the British colonial period between 1870 and 1910. So first, at the beginning of this period, so between 1860 and 1911, there were the arrival of thousands of laborers and traders, most of whom were indentured servants from India. In 1979, also the British defeated the Zulus in Natal. And in 1980 and 81, the first South African War between the British and the Boers began. In the mid-1980s, gold was discovered in Transvaal, and this triggered a gold rush at the time, which of course then also triggered mobility or migration during the period. In 1867, diamonds were also discovered in Kimberley. In 1899 and until 1902, there was the Second South African War between the British and the Boers. And in 1910, you had the formation of the Union of South Africa by former British colonies of the Cape and Natal, and the Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. So between 1860 and 1911, as I mentioned before, there was the arrival of thousands of laborers and traders, most of whom again were indentured servants from India. During this time period, nearly 150,000 indentured laborers crossed from India and arrived in Natal. The system, though, of indentured labor was stopped in 1911. After serving their indentured period, the first category of Indians were free to remain in South Africa or return to India. By 1910, around a quarter of the indentured men returned to India, but most of those stayed and then basically constituted the forebearers of the majority of present-day South African Indians. If we look now at the mid-1980s, this is when gold was discovered and triggered a gold rush, and then there was also the discovery of diamonds. So before 1886, the Transvaal Republic is estimated to have been the home of some, let's say, 40,000 whites and predominantly Dutch-speaking immigrants, and 300,000 indigenous residents from places throughout southern Africa. Within a year of the discovery of gold, though, in Johannesburg, the whole reef was estimated to have some 7,000 people, with 3,000 residing in Johannesburg itself. By 1895, Johannesburg was known to hold over 100,000 people, and this number then was equally divided between black and white residents. The South African War between 1899 and 1901, though, saw a temporary downturn in the Johannesburg population, partly due to the exodus of the foreign community who fled to the reef, and partly to the departure of the Afrikaans residents on commando duty. So the closure of all of the mining activity in October of 1899 brought to an end basically the economic activity in the region. If we then look at the South African wars between 1880 and 1881 and 1889 and 1902, the post-war population patterns really resumed their previous trends and also rapid growth. This was assisted partly by the influx in 1904 of some 64,000 Chinese indentured laborers. So again, this is now a new group entering South Africa. Following their repatriation in 1910, they were then replaced in the mines by the introduction of migrant black labor. Much of it was recruited from neighboring territories, and initially these men came from Mozambique, but later on they were also drawn from British colonies that were, of course, further afield. Now, between 1910 and 1948, we saw the Union of South Africa being created. So in 1913, there was the Land Act. This was introduced to prevent blacks, except from those living in the Cape Province, from buying land outside of reserves. In 1934, the Union of South Africa Netherlands Parliament enacted the Status of the Union Act, which declared the country to be a sovereign and independent state. Now, between 1948 and 1994, we had the really brutal apartheid period. In 1948, there was the policy of apartheid, or separatedness, adopted when the National Party took power. In 1950, the population was then categorized by race. And there was the Group Areas Act that was passed to segregate blacks from whites at the time. In the 1970s, more than 3 million people were forcibly resettled in what were considered black homelands, as I quote, in this period. So we did see a lot of disruption and a lot of movements of people during this time to separate the races. In 1984 to 89, there were township revolts and there was a state of emergency that was also called. In 1989, public facilities started to become desegregated, and many of the ANC activists were freed. In 1991, there was the start of multi-party talks. In 1993, there was an agreement on an interim constitution. And in 1994, there was democracy. So Nelson Mandela's ANC party won the first democratic elections of the time. And in 1996, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, began its hearings. So how did apartheid affect migration? Well, many Black South Africans were relegated to homelands, which were not considered to be part of white South Africa. This really outlined the extent to which migration was really inorganic at the time and defined by the desires of the white elite for very strong separation. Then from 1994, from the time of democracy to modern day, we've really had a democratic era. South Africa has become an economic hub and a major migration destination for many other African migrants. There have also been special visas in times of crisis. And also important to note is that we have seen instances of xenophobic violence and absolutely a rise and an increase in xenophobic attitudes and violence towards migrants from other African countries coming into South Africa. So there are a number of special visas that South Africa also issues for times of crisis, and these are generally offered to neighboring country residents during times of crisis. So for example, in 1996, there was an amnesty for nationals from the SADC region that was created. This first brought 124,000 migrants, and from 1999 to 2000, there was an amnesty from people from Mozambique, and from 2009 to 2010, there was also a special dispensation for Zimbabweans that occurred during the hyperinflation crisis. And finally, in 2016, there was a special dispensation for Basotho and Lesotho citizens who wish to stay in South Africa. They only received, though, 48,000 applications when they had expected around 400,000 applications at the time. So mentioned already instances of xenophobic violence. Also in 2008, 2015, and 2019, there were particularly notable periods of violence. South Africa's public opinion has really become ridden with xenophobic attitudes towards foreign nationals, which were exemplified in these periods. That these also led to a number of xenophobic attacks on immigrants that left thousands displaced and hundreds murdered at the time. I will talk more about this also in our video on the migration situation today. Of course, if you're interested also in the migration policy, please do check out that video. If you're interested in a number of the other migration country study videos that we have on the channel, please do check that out. If you like this video, please do like it, subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos that I upload every week. And I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.